Floating pylons. I had had this crazy idea of building these pylons, which were basically round containers or long, basically like the same shape as a boat kind of thing. They would have like a peak and then like a flat spot around it. To give kind of like this kind of a shape. You know, but like what's it called, and they would float them in with floats, and then they would sink them into the mud, and then they would pump the water out, and then they would dig down, and these things would settle down into the dirt, and then they would dig down as far as they could go, into the mud, and then these things would be wide enough that, and then with a superstructure on top, they really wouldn't move around that much. But I had this idea, when I was a kid, that they would build these things and then float them in and then sink them down into the mud base and then dig them out. Well, pump them out first and then scoop out the sill as much as they could, and then dig down by hand as much as they could underneath the bottom, to level them out and everything, and then start pouring concrete on top and build these great big, basically pylons in the middle of a river. And this was one of my ideas as a child that I thought of how to get across a river, because before they would basically just pile stuff in there, but you couldn't really get ships across there. So it was put to me, well, how do you do this? And I thought, well, you could do this, which is basically build a big steel thing in this shape, and then float it in, and then sink it down in the mud, and then pump out the water, and then dig it down, and then put in, and then drive in some steel, and then start building concrete or rocks even, I said, but concrete and stuff on up, until it gets up above the water, and then build a bridge over the top of it. It was one of my ideas, for building bridges across waterways. Because you could fabricate these things in a shop. Basically they're just big riveted together. And you could rivet them together or whatever. And then float them in, and then basically sink them down. That keeps the water out. And then later on, I even thought of it. Well, at first they were big steel flat things, but then I thought, well, maybe the corrugated sides would give more strength to the steel. You could use a thinner one if you use corrugated sides, and then it would keep it, because mostly as you go down, the water pressure wants to buckle you in, not really buckle you that way. So with the corrugated sides, it made it so they could use less steel for the actual things, and then sink them in, and then dig them out, and then pour concrete and stuff on up. And then that's how they would build across bridges, build across waterways. It was one of my ideas, and they tried it out, and it really worked really, 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 really well. I've always been an inventor of things, invented steam and stuff and other things, and that was one of my ideas, and it was very easy to pump out, and as well as dig out, using the technology, and they were able to do some really big bridges because of it. And it was one of my ideas, when I was young, about how to do. A lot of my ideas were involving, I did really good with the simple stuff, of course, and I had the manpower and the people to do it, so a lot of bridges were done because of me. And there was also, also I employed a lot of stone cutters, so there was a lot of stone cutting bridges, that were built as well, where they would build stone bridges. And, it was never really, it never really mattered how long it took. It was just like, hey, you could do this, blah, blah, so a lot of bridges were built out of stone blocks. And then later on, as concrete became more common and steel became more common, they were able to move over to concrete and steel. My people built a lot of bridges, stone bridges, that were basically stacked stone. And then later on, they even used concrete mortar to actually, keep them in place. But some of the early bridges were all basically big, huge, monolithic stone, stacked stone. Kind of like the pyramids, only smaller. For bridges and stuff. That's how a lot of that came about. Anyway, and then, like I say, later on, I thought of the corrugated siding, which was used a lot in the Sydney bridge as well for the concrete. It was a good, strong metal idea, and I did some other inventing, like the A-frame stuff and A-frame hangers. And it's kind of funny. The rivets actually gave a little bit more of play with the thing, because it wasn't such a rigid structure. So I did a lot better with my bridges than I did with my boats, because Yeah, and there's some tar stuff in there too. They use tar to seal stuff a lot. It was a very good sealant. Um, so yeah, I mean that's how how a lot of my bridges were built. And how I personally designed and invented a lot of the things for the bridges, and how like they were able to build bridges through water because because I said, well, you just build a big steel thing and then leave the steel or take the steel away. It's not that big of a deal. It's just steel. I mean, back then it might have been a bigger deal than it is now, but with big steel things, I mean, bridges last for a long time, and the steel kind of protected the concrete anyway, so it worked out pretty good for that. So anyway, and that's how like building a railway across the Thames. How I played into that. In the Sydney Bridge and stuff, and how I became so part of so many bridge building things is just giving up. Giving them ideas. I mean, I had been the original basic bridge builder, and I believe that's how I got into the whole snorkeling thing too. Is that some of the bridges, the rock things had to be laid down inside the things, and they had to go and down there and kind of fit them in underneath the water. So there were divers that were used and stuff for some of the bridges, which were a very costly and expensive thing, which really didn't work out too well. And fortunately, I invented the corrugated siding before any of those really, before they took too long. But they would have done them eventually anyway. Um, and that's how like I became owner of so many bridges and so much infrastructure and trains and everything else is because of all that.